I want to just welcome those of you watching and participating in our international Healing Centered Education Conference, where we're kind of leaning on a theme of capacity building in times of change. I'm here joined with my dear brother Anu Gupta, just a wonderful inspiration to me and how he's leveraged his commitment to mindfulness from the perspective of social justice and his legal background to kind of combat and reduce and allow us to process bias. Anu, how are you? How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me. And this is such a powerful and important conversation for our times now.
Yeah, brother. I want to just take as you can hear, I'm just really grateful for the kind of path you've laid out for yourself. And I was able to kind of see your work in the field in a couple of ways, not just your recent book, but your consulting too, the way you've consulted with organizations. I've watched you consult for organizations like B Lab US and Canada and directly there. And then I've heard of your work in other places. So just kind of just admiring you from a distance. And you just wrote this book. Tell us a little bit about the book.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the book is called Breaking Bias, and it's really my life's work. As you mentioned, I'm trained as a human rights lawyer, as a social scientist, and basically I came to the work of bias after working as an attorney and recognizing that, we can change all the policies that we want and make, use the perfect language to make it feel inclusive. But unless we shift hearts and minds, we're really not going to make any movement around equity, fairness, justice, equality. And that's what we've seen in the last 10 years, right? There's been a lot of chipping away of policies because they can be changed. And the perceptions of the humans that are executing on those policies remain the same. So for me, this work of breaking bias is really the work of consciousness shift, right?
Mm,
And really rooting this work in our common humanity.
hmm
So beginning to shift the underlining, misinformation and information gaps that
mm,
really power inequity and injustice. And for me, writing this book, of course, I've always wanted to write a book, but I thought it would be like in a decade or so. But two things happened during the pandemic. First was in 2020. I had the opportunity to be in conversation with Oprah and author Isabel Wilkerson around her book, Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents, which was really in line with the way I perceive human hierarchies to be around the world. And it was a really powerful conversation, 8 episodes. Folks can check it out, the Oprah Book Club podcast. But the whole time I was like, we're diagnosing the problem really well. And there's
mm.
been so much research around the problem, but we weren't talking about the solution. And that's what I've been working on for the past, 10 years, 20 years, even when thinking about these healing modalities of mindfulness, compassion. So a seed was planted. She spends the last chapter of her book talking about radical empathy. But then how do we train people in radical empathy? How do we actually build radical empathy? But then 4 months later, we all witnessed what happened on January 6th and what's to come with this current election. And I just had a lot of sleepless nights. And even though I trained, thousands and thousands of professionals in breaking bias, it felt like not even a drop in the bucket. So this was kind of the origins of like wanting to bring all of this research together in one place and expanding the conversation around bias beyond race. Of
Hmm.
course, there's a whole chapter on race, but the intersectional nature of bias, whether it's gender or sexuality or age or ethnicity or disability or you name it, religion, political beliefs, but really understanding that bias is really a learned habit that has
Hmm.
flat root causes. And just as it's learned, it can be unlearned, the power of neuroplasticity and the tools that can help us unlearn them.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And part of the conference theme is capacity building. And the term kind of comes out of its origins are in international development and nonprofits.
Yeah.
The classic capacity building grant.
Yeah.
But then it kind of it ends up growing in the 20th century into like leadership, into organizational development, into even in the corporate space. And you know, I thought that it might be useful at this point to bring up this idea of capacity buildings because it provides a really broad umbrella when it
Yeah,
organizational life
yeah,
and that many of us can kind of hook our work uh, into it and play a little bit in an expansive way. So I'm curious around because that's what you've been doing is really expanding people's capacities in relation to kind of radical empathy, but more importantly, really kind of breaking bias. Could
yeah.
more about like how your work with breaking bias is profound methodology for capacity building.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny because I got my master's in international development and worked in this field of capacity building for a long time. My first nonprofit was actually working in Myanmar, an authoritarian country, around capacity building. Um, so it's kind of a gentle reminder that, oh yeah, like I've been doing this work in a different capacity now. And I think for me, what capacity building really means around this work of inclusion or belonging or diversity or, you know, it's really, or mindfulness and compassion and wellness and well-being is really helping people see their inner capacity and really building their inner capacity first. Because oftentimes we think about this work of, healing or equity or DEI as something that needs to be done out there. But I think for me, it's really about focusing on the self first, and really building that inner ground, that inner soil to be able to then respond to the challenges of inequity and injustice. And what that meant, what that's meant for me is really those five tools of that help us break bias. So what bias really does, whether it's conscious bias or unconscious bias, is that it distorts how we perceive, reason, remember, and make decisions. So when it comes to a professional, it could be something as, a doctor giving care to their patient. And of course, we've seen the figures around massive disparities across identities, whether it's a teacher or a police officer or, a hiring manager at a big corporation. So those are the type of, but on the product side, it can also be how algorithms are designed. What are the underlying data sets, which of course then have a huge impact on so many people around the world. So for me, it's really helping people, use this PRISM toolkit. PRISM are the five tools that are really somatically informed and are rooted in contemplative sciences that have each shown to be efficacious in measurably reducing conscious and unconscious bias. And it
Mm,
really, we start the practice of PRISM with M and then move our way up to P. And it kind of
mm,
maps to our bodies also. So really begin with M for mindfulness, which, as you know, is really about being aware of, you know, whatever's happening in the present moment. But when it comes to bias, being aware of stereotypes, which are, false narratives, gross generalizations about a human, but how they appear in the mind, but also in the body. Like, what
mm,
is the tension? What is the accompanying sensation of stereotypes in the body? Then we move to stereotype replacement, which is just when we recognize and become mindful of stereotypes, we replace them actively
mm,
to, positive counterexamples. So that's really
mm,
about creating new mental models. So we're basically, neurons that fire together, wire together. So we're kind of rewiring our neural circuitry around creating new mental models. In the lab, they, did with Black men, like think of Dr. King, but it doesn't have to be like someone is, you know, glorified as Dr. King. It could be one's, friend, partner, spouse, classmate, whatever. Then we move to individuation, which is basically cultivation of curiosity, interest, investigation.
mm,
I'm with Angel, I'm with the fullness of who Angel is versus my ideas of him. He's a scholar of education, healing center education, all the things. Those are
mm,
great, but really getting to know that individual. And that's where we get to the particularity of a human's identity.
mm,
We move to heart practices, so pro-social behaviors that are a whole set of heart practices like compassion, loving kindness, equanimity, joy, generosity. And what these tools do, these skills that we're building, radical empathy, is it's shifting the underlying valence or the affect associated with stereotyping because it's uncomfortable, it's negative, right? That's what we're beginning to shift is really entering into the emotional bodies that are really
mm,
stored, that we experience somatically. And these practices really help us do that. Particularly what they do is they mitigate fear.
mm.
because the roots of bias is really fear, this limbic
Mm,
response in our bodies. And then lastly, it's perspective taking, which is kind of the act of imagining what it's like to be in other people's shoes.
mm,
This is like, a practice widely practiced, in both the corporate setting, but also in entertainment. Good actors practice this before they embody someone else's experience. But also like
mm,
creative agencies, they do the empathy mapping, they kind of imagine being in the consumer's shoes or the user's shoes. But that's something we can all do, right? And that helps us really break down these boxes altogether. And my hope is really that these tools are what's going to become the currency of the 21st century as we begin
mm,
to kind of break down these artificial constructs that limit our human potential, really, of race, of gender, of sexuality. And we can really be the fullness of who we are, right? Beyond these constructs. Of course, they're a part of us, but they don't limit who we are. Currently, in our paradigms, they do.
mm. No, I'm just taking that in and just really appreciate I can hear just your lived experience as a scholar and practitioner and how you articulate the work, and thank you for the PRISM framework. I want to leave this conversation with a even harder question, actually.
Oh,
Um, it seems like capacity building, at least from your perspective, slightly, and kind of mine as well, like there are several moves. One is like capacity building, but internal, right? Internal capacity building and harnessing and channeling and being in tune with our internal landscapes and how that's connected to bias, but also like all these other empathic powers that we have to feel into others and oneself, and how that relates to how we perceive and act in the world. And
mm,
I think also capacity building has this like kind of external facing
yeah,
aspect to it that then interface with the world, right? That
yeah,
those inner capacities now
yeah,
are leveraged to change the organization that we're embedded in, the community they're embedded in, the larger world, right? So like there's like this dynamic tension between internal and external capacity building that I hear. And so my question, I want to, you're so ready for this stuff, it seems like in this kind of historical moment, there's just a lot happening, and I think we're tasked to just solve and fix and confront so much,
yeah,
challenges, right? So it just makes the conversation around breaking bias and capacity building even more timely. Um, what I've sensed and what I've heard, especially with the ways that like technology is advancing so fast and the ways
yeah,
in which the crises that are unfolding are so interrelated, that there seems to be this mismatch between the speed of change and the speed of which that we're evolving our consciousness.
mhm,
Mismatch there.
yeah,
We're not evolving at the level at the speed that we need to confront the problems that we are confronted with. And I'm just curious to ask you, I know the foreword is written by His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and you've just finishing kind of like finishing this first big book of yours. Any thoughts there, on the question of consciousness? Because I think that may be the biggest question when it comes to capacity
yeah.
is, but it's still related to breaking bias, because breaking bias, I think, is a consciousness raising and expanding methodology. Any thoughts?
Yeah. Well, that's what I call it. That's what I say in the book, like in the introduction, that the work of breaking bias is the work of shifting consciousness, not just to shifting it, to elevating it, our
Mm,
collective human consciousness, and it's directly connected. So when we talk about the PRISM toolkit, what we're really doing is we're really rewiring our brain so the way we associate with ourselves and one another shifts, right? And of course, there's an external component to it, offering spaces for others to, whether it's in a workplace or a community or even a family, to begin to shift consciousness around how we perceive ourselves and one another. And that, of course, has an institutional and a systemic outcome over time. But it's really kind of rooted in this theory of change, that change begins with us. And then that's where we're beginning to really create those circles of influence. And that's how any sort of successful social movement has spread, whether from the civil rights movement, in the United States to the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa to what happened in my ancestral lineage in India with the overthrowing of British Raj. But I think the deeper question that you're asking is, well, how is this connected to, what we generally understand consciousness shift to be? So there are two books that have really deeply influenced me around this. And not just books, these are like scholarly works that I 100% know. I don't even have to like justify it as a belief. I just know this to be true. The first is really Eckhart Tolle's A New Earth. So he really talks about that, when we look at deep time, there is a shift in consciousness and it's evolving towards kindness, understanding, collaboration. And we're seeing that already in like the short span of modernity in the last 500 years, from where we were in the late 1500s to where we are now. And so that's one that's really hopeful. And it's, really bringing in kind of a Western way of thinking, infusing a lot of the indigenous and the animist and Eastern philosophies. The other is really directly from my lineage. So I come from a lineage of Kriya Yoga and Buddhist, personally Buddhist spirituality, and I'm deeply, deeply embedded in South Asian spiritual traditions in that way. And there's a book by a basically a realized master, Sri Yukteswar, called The Holy Science. And the way he really thinks about human consciousness is in Vedic philosophy, our consciousness is really divided in yugas. And it's a 24,000 year long cycle that's divided in two phases, ascending and descending of 12,000 years. And what he calculated is that the age of, immorality or the age of darkness was really 1,200 years that ended in the year 1700. And if you think about it, that was the age of, the dark ages in Europe, and just so many atrocities against women, against people who loved plants or played with animals, and just so many wars across the world, right? As societies really expanded from being one with the earth to really hating the earth. One of the deepest biases that we have as humans is biophobia and speciesism, very anthropomorphic ways of being. But since 1700, there's been ascending cycle, the second age, which is the Dvapara Yuga, or beginning to be the age of morality. It's a 2,400-year long cycle. So we're in like year 300. But even in that year 300, we've seen massive changes around how we relate to the earth. There's consciousness shift taking place there, how we relate to other species, women's rights, rights of LGBTQ plus folks, other minorities, intermarriages, and collaboration. So we've seen a lot of shift, but this is again, deep time work. And that's what I really go into in the book, 10,000 years of recorded human history. In chapter 2, we really talk about how, the shift in consciousness is really a battle between inclusion and exclusion consciousness. And we are in a paradigm right now, which is the inclusion paradigm, particularly since the 1940s with the Human Rights Charter. So it's been in the ascending cycle, but there's been a lot of challenges because the effects of, Kali Yuga, the age of darkness, are still there. Trillions of causes and conditions that are still, ripening, those seeds are still out ripening. So for me, that really helps understand and be equanimous with what all the changes we're experiencing and all the suffering we're witnessing, and to know that the suffering isn't new. There have been genocides and theriocides, which are basically genocides against other more than human animals, all of modernity, right? So really remembering that this is kind of a legacy of that, but also trusting that it's moving forward and I have something to contribute to it. Now, the last point that you mentioned, that there's just so much accelerated change that's taking place, particularly in the tech sector and finance, and rapid shifts, particularly with the advent of AI. And I feel like that's probably how our ancestors felt 100 years ago, or, with the advent of broadcast media, or, the digital media like 30 years ago. So I feel like that's just kind of the story of our humanity when we kind of are in our minds all the time. So I think the invitation for me, for all of us, particularly those of us that are, focused on capacity building, is to slow down. Be in our bodies and our hearts, and know and trust that we're doing the best we can. And that's why these networks that you've created, that you're part of, that you're building, are so important, because we really can't do it alone. We're so interdependent. And each one of us has a role to play. And my hope really is that as we're kind of evolving to building the next civil rights movement of the 21st century, we're really kind of coming together and not having this hierarchical single leadership model, but that all of us share certain ethos and values to contribute to what's possible.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm just so grateful that I was able to kind of ask you that, just to kind of allow you to land in that question and share how the book is an extension of your response, and just kind of allowing the community to listen into just your brilliance, and also this incredible moment we have to expand our consciousness and
Yeah.
capacities. So just I'm just grateful that we get a chance to walk on this path together, man.
I agree. I'm so honored, and I'm so honored to know you and have seen you in action and just so inspired by you. So you're one of those people that fuels my own spirit. And like, oh, Angel's there. He's doing this work. So whenever I'm like, when I feel down or, in any way feeling doubtful of my own path, I'm like, oh, wait, no, I'm not alone. There are all these folks.
Not alone, brother. I'm excited about watching you
Yeah.
grow, and the next book. Even though I know I'm sure you want to do have a diet from that intense process, but yeah, just thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yes, and really looking forward to seeing how the community responds to your contributions to the conference.
Likewise, likewise, take good care and I hope to be in touch with community as well. This is our work together.
Yes, indeed.